Welcome to The Last Walk. I'll take a look at why even prepared hikers can miss the dangers around them. They had the gear, the experience, and the planning, but some warnings are hidden in the landscape itself. But somewhere along Kendrick Mountain Trail, the conditions around them changed in ways that were difficult to see from the surface. They were watching the trail ahead of them, but the real danger was waiting somewhere they weren't looking. It was September 9th, 2022. High in the Kendrick Mountain Wilderness, north of Flagstaff, Arizona, along the boundary of the Kaibab and Coconino National Forests, parts of the area were still showing the effects of wildfire. The high-elevation forest of ponderosa pine, mixed conifer, and aspen included sections affected by the burn, where blackened trees, damaged vegetation, and other post-fire hazards remained. Nafon Bucher was 25 years old and worked as a residential electrician in Flagstaff, Arizona. According to people who had previously hiked with him, he was familiar with outdoor trips and generally prepared carefully for backcountry outings. Friends described him as someone who usually researched routes and checked conditions before hiking. I like this about him already, honestly. The guy who checks conditions before he leaves is exactly the kind of guy you'd expect to come home safely. His work as an electrician required attention to detail and problem solving, traits that friends said also showed in the way he approached outdoor trips. However, his professional experience did not necessarily translate to recognizing every backcountry hazard. Friends who had previously hiked with Nafon described him as someone who usually researched routes, checked conditions, and prepared carefully before outdoor trips. He was often the person who helped organize plans and made sure essential supplies were accounted for before leaving. His experience with hiking and camping contributed to his confidence in navigating backcountry environments, although it did not make him immune to hazards that could be difficult to recognize. Holly Steiner was 24 and worked as a veterinary technician. She had developed an interest in landscape photography and often carried a camera during outdoor trips, using hikes as opportunities to photograph changing environments. She used hiking trips as opportunities to photograph natural environments and changing landscapes. The aftermath of wildfire particularly interested her because burned forests, open views, and recovering ecosystems created different photographic opportunities compared with untouched areas. For many photographers, landscapes after wildfire present a complicated contrast. The damage is visible, but so is the beginning of recovery. Burned trees, exposed terrain, and areas of new growth can create images that show both destruction and renewal at the same time. Her equipment was modest, a single mirrorless camera and a couple of lenses she carried in a padded case inside her pack, along with a tripod she used for longer exposures at dawn and dusk. Colleagues at the veterinary clinic where she worked recalled her talking about the northern Arizona trip in the days before, describing it as a chance to photograph a landscape transformed by wildfire graphic quality that the green forests she usually photographed simply couldn't match. Nafon and Hallieg had been dating for a little over a year by that September. During that time, they had gone on several hiking and camping trips together, making backcountry outings a regular part of their time as a couple. By then, they already had experience with overnight trips. This wasn't a couple winging it. They had a rhythm down. And that's what makes this one sting a bit more for me. They brought gear that matched that kind of outing, a two-person tent, sleeping equipment for high elevation conditions, and supplies for a short stay in the backcountry. Friends who had joined them on previous trips said they had a system when preparing for these outings. Nafon usually helped organize equipment and set up camp, while Halig handled things like food supplies and photography gear. Over time, they had developed a routine for getting ready before heading out. So that weekend, they planned to hike Kendrick Mountain Trail in the Kendrick Mountain Wilderness north of Flagstaff along the boundary of the Kaibab and Coconino National Forests. The trail moved through ponderosa pine forests before climbing into higher elevations with mixed conifer and aspen trees. The route was not considered an extreme technical climb, but its elevation and remote setting meant conditions could become more demanding than they appeared at lower elevations. Hikers on Kendrick Peak often have to account for changing temperatures, uneven terrain, and limited assistance once they move deeper into the forest. In high country environments, a trail can feel familiar and accessible while still requiring careful attention to changing conditions. But parts of the Kendrick Mountain area still carried the effects of past wildfires. Burned trees, damaged vegetation, unstable volcanic soils, and areas affected by erosion remained part of the landscape, creating hazards that were not always obvious from the trail. And even though the fire itself was over, some dangers remained. Visitors were warned that post-fire hazards, including weakened trees, unstable soil, and erosion, could still be present in parts of the area. I want to be fair here, the trail was open. There was no barrier, nothing screaming for them to turn back. They knew the warnings were there, they knew the area had been changed by wildfire. But like many hikers who encounter a trail that remains open, the danger may have felt distant until the landscape revealed what the warning was really about. The landscape was also different from a typical forest setting, with burned sections existing alongside areas that had not been as heavily affected. Nafon had previous experience hiking in northern Arizona's mountain areas, giving him some familiarity with the type of terrain they were entering. Available information does not indicate that the couple made any unusual changes to their normal approach to outdoor trips before entering the area. The area remained open to visitors, although post-fire hazards were present. This distinction was important because wildfire recovery does not happen all at once. A forest can transition from an active emergency area into a place where recreation resumes while certain risks remain. The absence of flames does not necessarily mean the landscape has returned to normal. The effects of wildfire can remain long after flames disappear. Across the Kendrick Mountain area, older burn scars have continued to influence the landscape, leaving some slopes more vulnerable to erosion, loose soil, and weakened trees. Recovery happens gradually, and a forest can appear calm while still containing hazards left behind by past fires. Standing trees could remain weakened after fire, while slopes affected by the burn could become unstable depending on soil conditions, weather, and fire severity. It was a reasonable assumption on its face. Fire moves through a landscape and leaves it looking finished, settled, done a scar rather than an ongoing process. A challenge with burn scars is that their hazards are not always obvious. The landscape can continue changing after a wildfire as damaged vegetation and root systems recover slowly. This is the part that gets me every time with these cases. Fire doesn't announce that it's still dangerous. It just goes quiet and looks finished. The effects of a wildfire do not disappear once the flames are gone. Burned areas can remain hazardous because damaged vegetation and root systems can leave some slopes more vulnerable to erosion and instability. The challenge is that these hazards are not always obvious. A section of ground can look stable from the trail while still being weakened underneath. Kendrick Peak is one of the highest mountains in the Flagstaff area outside the San Francisco peaks. September weather at that elevation can change quickly, with mild afternoons giving way to cold nights and periods of gusty wind. Past wildfire impacts left portions of the landscape vulnerable to hazards such as falling trees, loose soil, and erosion after weather events. At elevations above 9,000 feet, overnight temperatures can become much colder than conditions in nearby Flagstaff. Weather observations from nearby stations indicated periods of increased wind overnight, a detail that would later matter far more than anyone hiking in that day could have anticipated. By early September, the area remained accessible to visitors, although Forest Service advisories continued to warn hikers about hazards associated with burned landscapes. Closure notices and trailhead information in the area cautioned that burned landscapes could contain weakened trees, unstable soil, erosion, and changing trail conditions. Hundreds of people may have passed through the area that season without incident, so I understand why it might not have registered as urgent. There was no active closure preventing access, no barrier blocking the trail, and nothing suggesting that the area was completely inaccessible to prepared hikers. But an open trail does not always mean that every hazard has disappeared. In burn areas, some dangers can remain hidden long after the fire itself has ended. Before starting their hike, Nafon and Halliag stopped at the Kendrick Mountain trailhead, where visitors were given information about conditions in the area. Forest Service personnel later confirmed that hikers entering the area were regularly advised about possible post-fire hazards, including weakened trees, unstable ground, and changing trail conditions. But, well, there isn't a detailed record showing exactly what was said between the couple and any Forest Service employee that day. It's not clear whether they received a specific warning beyond the general information provided to visitors. What happened after they began hiking was later pieced together mostly from the evidence they left behind. Their camera was eventually recovered, with the memory card still intact, allowing investigators to review the photos taken during the hike. Those images helped establish parts of their route and timeline, but they couldn't show what decisions the couple made after the last recorded photographs. I keep thinking about the fact that her camera survived and told part of the story when she couldn't. There's something almost unbearable about that. During the search, rescue personnel documented conditions in the burn area that were consistent with recent wind exposure, including damaged trees and unstable terrain. A nearby camper staying in the broader area reported hearing trees cracking overnight and described periods of strong wind. However, the camper could not determine whether those sounds were connected to any specific tree failure, the couple's campsite, or the events that occurred afterward. The account provided context about the overnight conditions, but did not establish what happened to Nafon and Halliag. That sound alone would have unsettled me if I were sleeping out there. Trees cracking in the dark in a burn scar is not a noise you just sleep through. Search teams later located evidence near the trail and surrounding slope that helped reconstruct the likely sequence of events. When hikers fail to return from planned backcountry trips, search efforts often begin with reconstructing their expected route. Investigators and rescue teams look at factors such as planned destinations, available photographs, equipment, terrain, and environmental conditions to narrow down where someone may have traveled. The position of recovered equipment, disturbed soil, and the location of the couple's remains suggested that they may have attempted to move around a trail obstruction before entering unstable terrain. However, because no one witnessed the accident itself, the evidence showed where they went, but not exactly why they chose that route. Search teams later identified their campsite in a dispersed area off the trail in a location where overnight use was allowed. The surrounding vegetation showed fewer obvious signs of fire damage, reflecting the patchy nature of wildfire impacts across the landscape. Although many hikers complete Kendrick Peak as a day hike, Nafon and Halieg had planned an overnight backcountry trip. Overnight, regional weather observations indicated periods of increased wind, conditions that can increase hazards from weakened trees in burned areas. The campers' account helped investigators understand what conditions were like in the area overnight. It showed that strong winds had affected the region, although it could not confirm exactly what happened at Nafon and Halig's campsite. The camper was able to describe the weather conditions and the sounds heard in the area, but he could not determine whether any specific tree failure was connected to their campsite. His account provided important context about what the area was like that night, but it did not establish what happened to Nafon and Halier. The slope beside the trail appeared passable, but conditions changed quickly in terrain affected by wildfire. Loose soil, exposed roots, and uneven ground made footing less predictable than it appeared from above. Sometime after sunrise, Nafon and Halieg broke camp. I find myself wondering what that morning actually felt like to them. Calm? Ordinary? Nothing that would have told them the ground itself had shifted overnight. From what investigators could determine, the couple may have left earlier than they had originally planned, although the exact reason was never confirmed. There was no direct record explaining their decision at that point. Changing weather conditions, the overnight winds, or other unknown factors may have influenced their actions, but the exact circumstances remain unclear. During the search, crews identified a large fallen snag blocking a section of Kendrick Mountain Trail. Its location, combined with nearby signs of movement away from the established route, became one of the factors investigators considered when reconstructing the couple's final movements. Based on its condition and the reported overnight wind conditions, investigators considered it possible that the tree had fallen after the couple entered the backcountry. The tree had created an unexpected obstacle along a section of trail they may have used during their return route, forcing anyone approaching that section of trail to either turn back, climb around the obstruction, or find an alternative path. The obstruction may have influenced the couple's movements, although the exact decision they made could not be confirmed. I don't think going around a fallen tree is a crazy call on its own. I've done that myself on trails that had nothing to do with fire. It's the terrain underneath that turned an ordinary workaround into something else entirely. Investigators believe they may have attempted to find a way around the fallen tree rather than immediately returning the way they had come. In mountainous terrain, hikers commonly make route adjustments when encountering obstacles, such as fallen trees, washed out sections, or difficult terrain. The decision itself would not necessarily indicate poor judgment, especially because the alternative path may have appeared short or manageable from the trail. Evidence found near the area suggested that the couple moved away from the established trail after encountering the obstruction. Investigators documented disturbed vegetation, displaced soil, and the location of recovered equipment, which together indicated possible movement onto the adjacent slope. Investigators believe they may have attempted to bypass the fallen tree through terrain that appeared passable but had been affected by wildfire damage. Investigators determined from the available evidence that Nafon and Halieg moved onto the slope beside the obstruction. However, because there were no surviving witnesses, the exact reason for that decision could not be confirmed. The evidence showed where they went, but not what factors influenced their choice. By this point, the challenge of the terrain was no longer the fire itself, but the hidden changes the wildfire had left behind. The slope appeared passable from the trail, but the conditions beneath the surface were harder to judge. This is exactly the kind of danger you can't see coming. The ground looks like ground right up until it isn't. So while the slope may not have looked unusual from the outside, the wildfire had already altered the terrain in ways that were not always visible before a problem occurred. The slope beside the trail showed signs of instability consistent with a recently burned landscape. Wildfire can damage vegetation and root systems that normally help hold soil together, leaving some areas vulnerable to erosion and sudden movement. The slope did not look obviously dangerous from the trail, but the wildfire had changed the terrain beneath the surface. Investigators believe the couple entered an area where footing was less stable than it appeared. Investigators believe the couple likely moved onto the slope while attempting to bypass the obstruction. The available evidence suggested they entered unstable terrain adjacent to the trail. The slope was not an obvious cliff or impassable drop, but a steep section of burned ground covered with loose soil, exposed roots, rocks, and debris left behind after the wildfire. As they moved across the slope, the surface conditions may have changed without being immediately noticeable. Burned terrain can be unpredictable. One section of ground may feel firm, while another area only a few feet away may be much less stable, especially on slopes affected by erosion and weather. A section of soil that appeared solid from above could still shift when weight was placed on it. This is the moment that haunts me a little bit. They were just probably walking, not scared, not reckless, just walking. And the ground made the decision for them. In areas affected by wildfire, the damage below the surface is not always easy to recognize just by looking at the ground. Based on the disturbed soil patterns and the location where their equipment was later recovered, investigators believed it was possible that one of the hikers lost footing while crossing the slope. The evidence suggested that the ground beneath them may have shifted, causing a downhill slide rather than a simple slip or stumble. However, the exact moment the incident began and the precise sequence of events could not be directly confirmed. Investigators had to reconstruct what likely happened from the physical evidence left behind. Investigators could not determine the exact sequence after the initial loss of footing. The second hiker may have fallen while moving through the same area or while attempting to cross another unstable section nearby. However, the evidence indicated that both traveled down the slope before coming to rest below the trail. The fact that they ended up together after all of it, I don't know, it doesn't fix anything, but it tells me neither of them was left to face that moment alone. The fall was not necessarily a single drop, but may have involved a slide through loose soil, rocks, exposed roots, and burned debris before reaching the lower section of terrain. The distance of the fall, the uneven surface, and the materials encountered along the way contributed to the severity of the injuries documented afterward. The injuries documented during the post-mortem examination were consistent with a severe fall through rocky, uneven terrain. The combination of trauma, difficult terrain, and their location away from the established trail would have significantly reduced their ability to move or seek assistance. The location of their equipment and the proximity of their remains suggested that they stayed together after the fall. Investigators could not determine whether either hiker was able to move, call for help, or reach additional equipment afterward. However, the combination of injuries, steep terrain, limited visibility, and surrounding hazards would have made self-rescue extremely difficult. Investigators could not determine the exact decisions Nafon and Haliag made after leaving the established trail. The sequence of events was reconstructed from physical evidence, environmental conditions, photographs, and the location where they were ultimately found. When Nafon and Haliag failed to return by the time they had told others to expect them, family members and friends contacted authorities, beginning a search effort. The search, however, was difficult almost immediately. The area's dense, standing dead timber and rugged terrain created major challenges for rescuers. Even the people trying to save them had to fight the same burned ground that took them. It's a brutal irony I don't think it gets talked about enough in these stories. From the air, visibility was limited by the burned forest and uneven landscape, making aerial searches more difficult. On the ground, search teams had to move carefully through sections of the burn scar. The same post-fire conditions that affected the area, unstable terrain, damaged vegetation, and weakened trees, also created hazards for the people trying to reach it. An additional wind advisory added another layer of difficulty, requiring crews to take extra caution while moving through certain areas. Search personnel faced a combination of steep terrain, burned vegetation, limited visibility, and unstable sections of ground throughout the operation. The conditions made it necessary for crews to balance the urgency of the search with the need to move safely through an area that had already been changed by wildfire. The medical examination concluded the injuries were consistent with a fatal fall. A post-mortem examination found injuries consistent with a fatal fall down steep terrain, with environmental exposure considered a possible contributing factor after the accident. Investigators believe the deaths resulted from injuries sustained during the fall, based on the available medical and scene evidence. To reconstruct the sequence of events, investigators relied on several pieces of evidence gathered over the course of the search. Information from Forest Service personnel about conditions in the area, combined with photographs recovered from Haliag's camera and other physical evidence, helped investigators establish the likely timeline before the accident. The account from the nearby camper provided additional information about overnight conditions in the area. Photographs recovered from Haliag's camera helped investigators estimate their location and timeline during the hike. Together, these findings allowed investigators to reconstruct the most likely sequence of events based on the available evidence. While no one witnessed the accident itself, the physical evidence suggested the couple likely attempted to bypass a trail obstruction before losing footing on unstable post-fire terrain, resulting in a downhill fall from which neither survived.